In 2018, 3 billion land animals were slaughtered for meat. Estimates for the amount of aquatic animals killed that same year range from 1 to 3 trillion. Is this acceptable? Are the lives of animals truly worth so little? Currently, the prevailing answers to both those questions is yes and yes. However, the fact that something is normal doesn't make it right. Morality is more than the consensus of the masses. Utilitarianism is the concept of achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. The interest view of ethics maintains that all and only those beings who can have interests have moral standing. Although it's commonplace, the consumption of animals runs counter to any ethical code that values the interests of any life beyond one's own, and is therefore morally indefensible. For such a bold claim, it might be necessary to ask, what is morality? Where does it come from? Many humans throughout history have argued that God is the source of morality. Many who make that claim might not mean it as such, but in this case, God can be understood as a representation of nature. While nature might struggle to offer a reliable rulebook for complex situations, morality, at the basic level of life and death, can be surprisingly simple. From observation, morality seems to be based on two things: fairness and consistency. Fairness. Does one deserve the treatment they're receiving? Consistency. Do one's morals contradict each other? Rather than morality being invented by humans as we go along or dictated to us by some ultimate being, there's good reason to view morality as rules of logic that are discovered over time. After all, one couldn't credibly assert that slave ownership was ethical right up until humans decided it wasn't, but rather that it was unethical all along, and humans were simply applying their morals inconsistently and unfairly. Morality is the process by which humans improve and find flaws in their existing concepts of fairness and consistency. Utilitarianism is one such method of understanding fairness, consistency, and morality in general. It's a predominant and popular philosophy. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, which is a theory that asserts the right action is understood entirely in terms of consequences produced. The goal of utilitarianism is to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. This moral philosophy embodies consistency in its commitments to impartiality. Everyone's happiness counts the same. Unfortunately, utilitarianism has its drawbacks. Classical utilitarianism is a hedonistic philosophy. It holds pleasure as its measure of what is good. As many philosophers have argued, there is more to good than just pleasure. Furthermore, pure utilitarians, in the case of evaluating what constitutes a positive outcome, would be in favor of a situation where 1,000 humans have to die in order to save 1,001 humans. What utilitarianism has in consistency, it often lacks in fairness. Does an individual deserve to be mistreated in order to ensure the happiness of others? Plus, it may be quite impossible to accurately determine what the consequences of any given action will be. One might predict that the deaths of 1,000 people will save 1,001, but in the end, only save 900. Therefore, utilitarianism might be a helpful guide for moral behavior, especially when the conditions are relatively straightforward, but it alone is not enough. An evolution of utilitarianism that attempts to solve many of these issues is known as the interest view of ethics, also called preference utilitarianism. The interest view provides a framework for determining whether a being has moral standing, and is therefore entitled to be considered when we are making moral judgments and decisions. According to this view, any entity capable of having interests has moral standing. If a being has awareness or sentience, they also have desires, and those desires should be accounted for. Rather than the goal being fulfilling the greatest good, preference utilitarianism entails promoting actions that fulfill the interests of those beings involved. This approach largely fixes the lack of fairness involved in standard utilitarianism. While preferences of individuals are paid attention to, it is much less likely that any individual will be used against their will. This regard for fulfilling interests essentially equates to the age-old maxim, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Veganism is a philosophy that takes this notion and extends it to all animals. As stated by the Vegan Society, veganism is a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. Vegans consider the desires of both humans and non-humans in their life choices. They do not consume any animal products or byproducts, nor do they support any non-food products that are derived from animals, like wool, down, or leather. One notable figure in the ethics of veganism is Peter Singer, an Australian moral philosopher. In his book, Practical Ethics, he advocates for preference utilitarianism. Singer argues that the capacity to experience suffering, along with the desire to avoid it, should be the primary interest that determines a being's moral standing. His most notable work, as it pertains to animal rights, is Animal Liberation, where he argues that there is no reason not to include animals in what constitutes the greatest good for the greatest number. A very important thing to note is that utilitarianism or preference utilitarianism isn't the only ethical pathway that leads to veganism, nor is it necessarily even the best one. As I stated in the beginning of this video, any ethical code that purports to care about others logically leads to veganism if it wishes to be consistent. I'm focusing on the utilitarian approach in this video for a few reasons. It's popular, many people weigh their decisions in terms of outcome, it's relatively simple and easily understood, and, most importantly, this video is a slightly reworked version of an essay I recently wrote for my philosophy class, where I couldn't go into all the schools of thought that veganism fits into. Similarly, if I did that in this video, it would be far too long. Basically, for a moral philosophy to be free of holes, it has to pay attention to the intention of the action, the consequence of the action, and the action itself. Because while a bad action with good intentions isn't great, and perhaps still not even justifiable, surely it must be admitted that it's better than a bad action with bad intentions. Or the opposite. A good example of that is big philanthropy. It would be better if billionaires donated to charity purely out of good intentions rather than using it to evade taxes, but it's better for that to be the case than for them to evade taxes in a way that doesn't benefit anyone else, such as offshore accounts. A pure deontologist couldn't admit that a bad action with a good outcome is any better than an equally bad action with a bad outcome. And a pure consequentialist couldn't admit that a good action with a good outcome is any better than a bad action with an equally good outcome. Thus, it's important to take the best of both. Most moral philosophies primarily take humans into serious consideration. However, if non-human animals are also taken into account, it becomes clear that we are not achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. Non-human animals far outnumber humans. There are 7.594 billion humans on Earth, and roughly 56 million human deaths each year, the vast majority of which are unintentional. Compare this to just one other species, the cow. There are 980 million cows on Earth, and 300 million cow deaths each year, the vast majority of which are intentional. But why should non-human animals be taken into account? Humans have a long history of self-importance. Unfortunately, it's only natural. Living life locked to one point of view makes it exceedingly difficult not to assume that point of view is the most valid or important. This phenomenon happens on a personal level, a collective level, and even a territorial level. It wasn't until the 16th century that humanity realized the planet they inhabit is not the center of the universe. Previously, the geocentric model was accepted so naturally because few people saw fit to question the notion that the universe was built with them in mind. As for the personal level of self-importance, any other person is likely to contest another's claim of being the center of the universe. With the personal and territorial levels out of the way, it becomes quite difficult to continue believing that mankind somehow holds a place of great importance in the universe. Humans are not as special as we think we are. The primary reason for the seeming superiority of humanity over other animals is our evolutionary adaptation to store information outside of ourselves. However, individually or collectively, it is hard to say we are better than other animals. We are not stronger than all animals, we're not more numerous than all animals, we're not more long-lived than all animals, we don't suffer more deeply than all animals, we aren't the only animals that make tools, we haven't been around the longest. The only attribute we can claim is intelligence, and even that claim is not complete. Chimpanzees have better short-term memory in certain cases. Elephants arguably have better long-term memory. Other animals are intelligent enough to not destroy the environment they depend on to live. Besides, intelligence doesn't make a good basis of moral standing. Even if you firmly believe that humans are more intelligent than all other animals, you must admit that not all humans are more intelligent than other animals. If it were the basis of moral standing, the degree of moral consideration any human is given would be proportionate to how intelligent they are. As Singer says, if possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans? In fact, humans have attempted to use intelligence as a way to devalue the lives of other humans. Much of the basis of racism rests upon a misguided notion that those with a different skin tone are somehow less intelligent. It turns out that not only is this incorrect, it's also not a very good idea. Not all humans are equally intelligent, but one trait that is shared among all humans is the capacity to experience suffering. It just so happens that this trait isn't unique to humans, but is universal throughout the animal kingdom. Non-human animals have interests no less valid than the interests of humans. All animals share the same basic desires by virtue of being conscious life forms. These include the pursuit of pleasure, the avoidance of pain, and the preservation of their own life. As described in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, pain or loss is felt more acutely than pleasure or gain. Therefore, avoidance of pain should be considered a more important interest than the pursuit of pleasure, and the preservation of life more important still. There is no reason to believe that the experience of suffering that humans have is any different to the experience non-human animals have. If one being wishes to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and can acknowledge that other beings wish for the same, is it not hypocritical to disregard their wishes? Furthermore, in Animal Liberation, Singer argues that the division between human and animal is arbitrary, pointing out that apes are closer to being humans than they are to being mollusks, and yet apes are included in the same term animal as mollusks are, while humans consider themselves to be separate. What reasoning remains, aside from blatant speciesism, that allows humans to ignore the interests of other animals? Not only should the interests of other animals not be ignored, but our treatment of them should be consistent and fair. Most people who own pets care deeply about their welfare, but what of the welfare of non-pet species? Take a pig, for instance. Dogs are treated with compassion, while pigs are treated as if they were mere machines devoid of sentience or the capacity to experience pain and suffering. Yet, both species are identical in that regard. It is not logically consistent to value the interests of some animals over others, especially when the animals in question have done nothing to deserve such punishment. A popular counterargument is that of humane killing, that the animals humans consume are killed with respect, or at least with a minimum of pain, a supposition that can only be maintained if one neglects to pay attention to how animals are actually treated. Even if methods of painless execution were used 100% of the time, which they aren't, can it really be considered humane to kill something that didn't need or want to die? It might be humane to put down the family dog after its cancer begins to make its life a constant torment, but it's much more of a stretch to call it humane to put down a pig who otherwise would have lived for many more years. The question, if you were on a deserted island with no other source of food, would you eat an animal, is a favorite among those attempting to dismantle veganism. But the answer is quite simple. A human would eat their own mother if it were the only means of survival. Luckily, in normal situations, eating one's mother is uncalled for. To eat one's mother without the justification of necessity is immoral, as any human would likely agree. It stands to reason that the same should be true when it comes to non-mothers, and even non-humans. It's important to consider what each party gains from their actions. When the interests of two parties are equal and opposite, such as, I will die if I don't kill you, the equation of morality is balanced. It doesn't really matter which side gets their way. It's justified in either case. Both sides are simply fighting for their survival. This is the situation most non-human animals find themselves in most of the time. This is one reason why it's difficult to find anyone advocating for non-human animals to stop eating each other. The situation humans are currently in is very different. It is no longer survival versus survival, but survival versus pleasure. An animal losing its life versus a human gaining a few minutes of sensory gratification. The suffering inflicted upon the animal is disproportionately greater than the pleasure gained by the human who eats it. Peter Singer mentions this concept of diminishing marginal utility in practical ethics. If two parties both want the same thing, and only one can have it, preference utilitarianism favors the party that benefits more from having it. The same reasoning can be used to address the claim that eating meat is a personal choice. Technically, it is a personal choice in the same way that all choices are personal choices. However, people usually use the term personal choice to mean that the choice in question only impacts them. While a decision such as dipping your hand into a vat of mustard may truly be a personal choice, as only you have to deal with the unfortunate consequences, eating meat cannot be said to be the same type of choice. One choice has an external victim, and the other does not. the animal being eaten was not consulted when the choice was made, and likely would have been in favor of a different choice if they had been. Another common counterpoint that inevitably comes up when discussing veganism is the "what about plants" argument, frequently even taking the form of "plants feel pain." It's the idea that if the protection of life is the goal, then one should also avoid the consumption of plants, as those too are alive. There are many defenses against this argument, but the simplest and most cogent of them is the utilitarian calculation. At some point, it does come down to survival. Humans must eat something. For a human to eat an animal, that animal must eat a great deal of plants. For every animal a person eats, they're additionally responsible for the deaths of all the plants that animal had to eat. Conversion of food into body mass is quite inefficient, especially when that food also had to convert food into body mass. Suppose that plants were evaluated to have just the same moral worth as animals. That's a lot of morally significant death for just one meal. If instead that meal consisted only of plants, the total death count would be far lower. This is even more true when one acknowledges that plants are not capable of having interests in the same way that animals are, and so have limited moral standing. Plants, as far as can be discerned, do not possess consciousness. They may have general interests defined by their DNA, such as replicate, but they do not experience joy or sadness. Therefore, even if you are highly concerned with the welfare of plants, the most effective options are to either cease living or only eat plants, as animals require a far higher volume of plant material to survive than humans do. In modern times, the consumption of animal products is unnecessary, with developing regions as possible exceptions. In situations like these, it could be said to be a necessary evil. The action is not a good one, but the consequence justifies it. Nobody likes necessary evils, and it should always be the goal to minimize them as much as possible. In places on Earth where killing animals is no longer necessary, which almost certainly includes the area you live in if your access to the internet is any indicator, the only part of necessary evil that remains is evil. The American Dietetic Association considers appropriately planned vegetarian or vegan diets to be healthful, nutritionally adequate, and appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, and adolescence, and for athletes. Furthermore, animal products in general are unnecessary. Products such as leather, wool, down, or fur do not provide any function that a non-animal product cannot also provide. Therefore, to engage in the use of animal products is an act of cruelty. Next to many other worthy causes, veganism is comparably easy. It does not require a great deal of effort to accomplish, and it does not preclude someone from participating in any other cause. Activism certainly helps, but it isn't a requirement to contribute to the reduction of animal suffering. The ease of accomplishing such a vast improvement in the lives of others provides little room for excuses. The average human eats 3 meals a day. Were they vegan, they would still eat 3 meals a day, only they would have a considerably lower risk of heart disease. It says a great deal about humans that for how simple it would be to end the exploitation and consumption of animals, the exploitation persists, and often at great personal costs. It is clear that mankind's treatment of animals is not based on any identifiable logic, and is inconsistent, unfair, and immoral. Non-human animals share the same interest as humans of avoiding pain, seeking pleasure, and living. Additionally, there is no reason to suspect that the pain a non-human animal experiences is lesser. Therefore, the interest of animals ought to factor into human moral judgments, and by ignoring their interests, we are far from achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. In the vast majority of cases, the consumption and exploitation of animals is an unnecessary torture for no reason other than sensory pleasure, and for one's temporary pleasure to be deemed more important than another's life is morally indefensible.